I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Driver 61's University Series. In today's tutorial we're going to be taking a look at the vast subject of braking. So braking is the strongest force that you can put through a car. A driver will pull more G when they're braking than when they're either accelerating or turning. And you can win or lose a lot of time when you're on the brakes. It's very important that into the big deceleration zones you're braking as late as possible and using 100% of the grip available to decelerate the car before you turn into the corner. If you take a look at this graph here, you can see brake pressure versus distance. And there's two lines on the graph, a blue one and a red one. The red one is the trace from my braking and the blue one is the braking trace from one of my students. You can see, if you look at the red line here, that we get on the brakes, we hold the brakes on for a little while and then we reduce the pressure until we're completely off and turning the car into the corner. Now you can see here that the blue line, my student, he's got on the brakes a little bit earlier than me and then he's had slightly less pressure than myself, and when we actually come off the brakes in this area here, it's very, very similar as we're entering the corner. But you can see that he's braked that bit earlier, and that actually equated to, because this was a real data trace, that equated to 10 meters later that I was on the brakes than him. And in terms of lap time, my lap, or in that section of track, I saved 0.2 of a second on my student. So you can see that it makes quite a big difference to lap time. Now, although being late on the brakes is very important, what's also very important, as we discussed in the previous tutorial, is that you arrive at the corner at the correct speed and with the car in the correct pitch as you're entering. And in the last tutorial we spoke about how this affects the balance of the car and where the grip of the car is in terms of the front and the rear of the car itself. So it's very important that in this area of the braking phase that we're controlling the pressure nicely so that we have a balanced car as we enter the corner. So your track car or your race car will have one of either two different types of braking system: a traditional non-ABS system or an ABS anti-lock braking system. A traditional non-ABS system is a simple mechanical system. You'll find it in race cars such as single-seaters, sports cars, and track day cars still nowadays such as Caterhams, Ariel Atoms, BAC monos. Now, a non-ABS system, when a driver puts more pressure through the brake pedal, it will decelerate the car and slow down the wheels until eventually they cease to turn, they lock up, and then what happens when a tyre locks up is that the deceleration isn't as quick as it might be, but more importantly, the driver cannot steer. Because the tyres are locked up, they're just going in the direction that the momentum of the car is taking them, and if you turn, the car will still go straight on. So a traditional braking system is good for good drivers that can brake heavily without locking the tyres up, but it's more difficult for drivers that don't have that feel, and braking at this level requires quite a lot of feel. An ABS system or an anti-lock braking system was originally designed for road cars, and it's one of the biggest safety advances that we've had with road cars. And it means that it's a system that has an electronic unit within it, and if it senses that the tyres are locking up, it will actually release the brakes for just a few milliseconds and then put them back on again. And while you can't decelerate quite as quickly as a good driver without the ABS system, it means that drivers who don't quite have great feel can still turn around an obstacle, which is what it was designed for on the road. Now, you'll find ABS systems still in some racing cars, GT cars, think Ferrari Challenge, for example. They have good ABS systems. And it really just stops this locking up of the tyres. So you can actually press the brake pedal really, really hard and it still won't lock the wheels up. So at the bottom here, you can just see a quick diagram of how big the braking distances are for the three different types of braking here. So on the top here, we have a traditional system, a non-ABS system, with a good driver braking at the grip threshold, so just before the tyres are breaking away. And you can see that the car will stop the quickest. Secondly, we have an anti-lock braking system here, and any driver can just smash the brake pedal as hard as possible and they will stop in a reasonable distance. And at the bottom here, we have a driver that has just smashed the brake pedal in a traditional non-ABS system. The wheels have stopped rotating, they've locked up, and we go beyond both the ABS and the threshold braking distances here. And the driver won't be able to steer because the tyres are locked up. So now we're going to take a quick look at the different phases of the braking area and also how a braking trace should look. So if you take a look at this diagram here, again we have pressure versus distance, and we split the distance up into 4 stages. Now the first phase actually has nothing to do with the braking. It's in fact how quickly a driver releases the accelerator pedal. Now a lot of amateur drivers that I coach, when they begin, they release the accelerator pedal way too slowly, and I think it's actually a habit from road driving where they just casually get off the accelerator before they get on the brakes. In fact, what you want to do is release the accelerator as quickly as possible when it's time to brake and then get on the brake pedal. The second phase is how we actually begin to get on the brakes. Now, when you transition from the accelerator to the brake pedal, you don't just want to stamp on the brakes. This could cause the tyres to lock or go into the ABS system and trigger the ABS system to work. So when you begin to get on the brakes, you really just want to squeeze the pedal on. Yes, it wants to be quite forceful, but we don't just want to be stamping on the brake pedal. The third phase here is where we modulate the pressure on the brakes. Now, as I'll go into a little bit later, we want to have slight under rotation of the tyres as we're decelerating. But what this means is we're just actually playing with the pressure to keep the tyres from locking or to keep the tyres from going into and triggering the ABS system. And finally, we have the phase where we're easing off the brakes as we're coming into the corner. Initially, the easing off wants to be quite quickly while we're in a straight line. And then as you can see here, and as we spoke about in the last tutorial on weight transfer, this section is where we're just managing the pitch of the car and the weight transfer of the car to have a perfectly balanced platform as we go into the corner. So there are slightly different ways that you should brake between a non-ABS system and an ABS system. Firstly, we're going to take a look at a non-ABS system, a traditional system. And the braking trace should be something similar to what I've just shown you in this diagram above. Now, the difficulty with a non-ABS system is using 100% of the grip available without locking the tyres up too much. So we want to be using all of the grip available in the deceleration zone. However, we don't have a safety device such as the ABS system to help us. So we have to do it all through feel. Now, in fact, the quickest way to decelerate a car with a non-ABS system is to have 3 to 10% slippage. Slippage or under rotation is where the tyres are actually rotating slightly slower than they should be for the car's speed. For example, if we're braking and at a specific point the car is doing 100 miles an hour, but the tyres are only rotating at 96, it means that we have 4% slippage or 4% under rotation of the tyres. And this slight under rotation actually gives us the most deceleration that we can take from the tyre itself. Now, it will vary between cars and different types of tyres, but it is somewhere between 3 and 10% usually. Now, as I just mentioned, you've got to be very aware of locking a front tyre or a rear tyre when you're braking without ABS. It's very difficult to get all the 4 tyres working with this 3 to 10% slippage without locking one of the tyres up. And you'll see if you look at a driver's data trace that when they're decelerating, they'll be modulating the brake pressure to make sure that the tyres aren't locking as they're decelerating. And it's a very difficult thing to do and requires a lot of feel from the driver. So now on to how to brake with ABS. Luckily, ABS systems require much less feel than a traditional non-ABS system. So you can really get on the brakes quite hard, safe in the knowledge that you won't lock any of the tyres up and you'll still be able to steer into the corner. However, even with ABS systems, the most efficient braking is actually just before the ABS kicks in. Once the ABS starts to work, the brakes are actually releasing themselves and then reapplying themselves very, very quickly. So it means that you won't be able to decelerate in the car quite as quickly as if you're just before the threshold where the ABS system will kick in. Now, when you get into the ABS, or the anti-lock braking system begins to work, you'll actually feel it in the pedal. Up until that point, the pedal feels normal, but as soon as the ABS system starts to work, you'll feel the pedal goes gravelly, and you can feel it pulsating and feeding back through your foot. So just look out for that, and you want to be braking with enough force just so that you're below this level. Now, in the final phase, just before or as you're turning the car into the corner, you need to brake in the same way whether you have the ABS system or not. We still need to be releasing the brake pedal nice and smooth as we turn the car into the corner. Now, this is because we're not using anywhere near the full braking capability, and we're actually just using the brakes to control or manipulate the pitch of the car as we come into the corner. There's also a difference in how we should brake for quick and slow corners, or rather big deceleration zones and smaller deceleration zones. As you can see by the two graphs here, it shows the braking technique going into a large deceleration zone and a slow corner, and a smaller deceleration zone and a faster corner. So into the slower corner, we want to be braking with as much pressure as you can, getting up to the grip threshold where we're just having the tyres under rotating slightly, taking all of the speed out of the car as quickly as possible before we release the brakes, and then gently, even more gently release them as we're controlling the weight transfer as we enter the corner. Now, into a quicker corner where the deceleration might not be as much, we actually want to brake with less pressure here. Now, the reason for this is that we're just controlling the platform, the weight transfer of the car much better. Now, what a lot of amateur drivers do into quick corners, because firstly, you're going in there very quick and it's quite unnatural to be turning at this speed. They take too much speed out of the car and they press the brake pedal too hard, which makes the car do this. It unbalances it a lot before you turn the car into the corner, which is obviously not what you want. What it's better to do is actually maybe brake a little bit earlier, but with much less pressure. So you knock a bit of speed out of the car, but you don't have this sudden weight transfer. You gently get on the brakes, come off the brakes, and then turn the car into the corner. The car will be much more balanced and you'll have more grip as you enter towards the apex. Now, how you want to think of this, and how you might hear coaches talking about it, is brushing the brakes. We're just gently pressing the brakes as we come into the corner. Not a tap, not a stamp, just a gentle brush on the brake pedal. A lot of drivers will use braking references to find the absolute latest point at which they can brake. Now, a braking reference could be a crack in the tarmac, the end of a barrier, a marshal's post, not a shadow like one of my drivers told me that they used once, because obviously they move throughout the day. Use braking references only in big deceleration zones where you're changing down 2 or more gears, for example. The reason being that if you're not decelerating that much, you'll arrive at the corner very quickly. And if you're looking out for a braking reference, you'll have actually missed the apex. So in the smaller deceleration zones, your vision as you enter the corner wants to be looking towards the apex, not for this braking reference. The other thing to remember with braking references is to actually be conscious of where you're braking each time and each lap. For example, when I go to a new circuit or I jump into a new car, I'll pick a reference for a corner, and I'll know that when I brake there, if I stop too soon, the next lap I'll know to go maybe 10 meters later until I actually find the ultimate braking point. Now, braking is obviously fantastic for slowing the car down as we go into a corner. It's what it's there for. But also, every so often, we might lose control of the car and have a spin. Braking can really, really help you when you're spinning out of control. Now, the reason being, for non-ABS cars, when you can lock up the tyres, it can actually help the car go in the direction that's away from all the barriers. So you imagine that you turn the car into the corner, you lose the rear end of the car and you begin to spin. Now when the car's momentum is taking it in the right direction, as in away from the barriers, it's time to stamp on the brakes. Now if you stamp on the brakes, it will lock all of the tyres up and the car will just continue along the path that it's actually going in, rather than the wheels beginning to rotate again, gaining some grip and then spitting you off into the barrier. Now, one thing that I see in some amateur driving, it happens more often than it should, is a driver will spin and then actually the car will be going backwards and they'll come back across the track. Now, in my opinion, this is an unacceptable thing for a racing driver to do. If you're spinning and you're heading backwards and you feel like you're coming back across the track, get back on the brakes as hard as you can. So again, you continue in the direction that the momentum of the car is taking you. So there are some common mistakes that we've gone over briefly in this tutorial already that amateur drivers make quite a lot. Firstly, we have releasing the accelerator pedal too slowly, and it's that habit from driving on the road. So when you're in your car on track, make sure that when you release the accelerator, we're doing it as quickly as possible before we then get on the brakes. Now, the next most common problems all come from poor vision when you're braking. Now, I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second, but the biggest mistakes are that drivers actually ramp up the pressure as they're coming into the corner. Now, if they're ramping up the pressure and ramping up the deceleration, then the first phase, or the beginning braking zone where they're not on the brakes so hard, it's just wasted time because they're not using the brakes as heavily as they could. The second one, which is not very nice when you're sat next to a driver coaching them, is that they'll have an inconsistent pressure where they get on the brakes and then a bit and then get back on and then come off, and it's changing the platform of the car all the time. But also in these phases where they're coming off the brakes, then we're not using 100% of the grip available, and it actually means that we could have braked a little bit later. And again, in the same kind of theory as inconsistent and the pressure, we have either braking too late or too early. All of these problems really come from poor vision. They come from the driver not looking far enough ahead, so they can't see where the apex to the corner is. They can't see how tight the corner is because they're not looking through the corner. And so they're making these movements to actually adjust the speed of the car as they're coming into the corner. If they were looking towards the apex before they got on the brakes, they would have a better idea of where to begin the braking, and then they can keep a constant pressure on the brakes as they're coming through the deceleration zone, and hopefully use 100% of the grip available under braking. So there are some more advanced braking techniques that we haven't actually gone over here today in this tutorial. I already thought there was quite a lot to fit in today. However, we're going to go over them in later tutorials in the more advanced sections later in this series. So we're going to take a look at left foot braking, where a driver will actually use their left foot on the brake pedal rather than their right foot. And it means that you can actually make this transition from the accelerator to the brake almost instantaneous. Now you can only do this in paddle shift cars where you don't need the clutch to downshift, or you can do it in manual cars with the clutch when you're going into a corner that doesn't require a downshift, because obviously you don't need to use a clutch. We have another article on this site. We don't have a whiteboard tutorial just yet, but we're going to make one on trail braking. Now, trail braking is how you brake coming into the corner. Now, we've already covered it slightly in the weight transfer tutorial, but we're going to go over it in more detail because it is quite a technical section to the website. Also, we're going to take a look at heel and toe, which you can already see in one of our tutorials. Now, this is where you blip the accelerator as you're braking and downshifting, so you get a smooth downshift. Now, this is important for braking and related to braking, because the whole reason that you blip the accelerator is to match the engine speed with the wheel speed of the car. And if you don't do this, you'll have an under rotation of the rear wheels, and it could cause them to lock as you're coming into a corner. Finally, we're going to take a look at, in a future tutorial, about brake bias. Now, in a racing car, you can adjust the amount of pressure that goes to the front and the rear axles under braking. Now, you do this because as the circuit changes, as the temperature changes, as the tyre wear increases, the amount of grip that the front of the car changes. And so in most race cars, you can actually change this difference in pressure to get the most out of all four tyres at any time when you're braking. So that's it for today's tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.